I said, what? I guess I should go home then. If you too old. Hello. I'm good. No. I was saying someone else was complaining.
We're going to call the meeting to order. First thing on the agenda, we want to approve our minutes from our last meeting. Can I get a
So moved.
seconded by Ms. Edwards? All in favor?
Aye.
Minutes are approved. First on the agenda is, are you, Jen? Our data. Discipline data. Is somebody? Okay. That was Ms. Eric. Okay.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
No.
My name's Gary Ritter. I'm from the University of Arkansas Office for Education Policy, and we've been asked to share discipline data with you for the schools that you're concerned with. And I have a PowerPoint, which I think you have access to. And there are also Excel files underneath it, Excel files that you can look at for each school for the past 3 years. And can we roll? Oh, there we go. There's the PowerPoint in front of you. Thanks for inviting us. We have been analyzing discipline data for the state for the past 3 years, and through the Office for Education Policy at the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville, we've been doing data on a variety of questions: student performance, student achievement, college attendance, all these sorts of things for the past 13 years. And so we may have data beyond what we're sharing with you here, or ideas. So if you have questions beyond what we're sharing with you here, I can talk to you about what we can or can't do. So there's our office website if you want to dig up data on all your schools, on all the schools within this region or across the state. Our website has all sorts of data that you can feel free to look at or peruse. But as to the specifics of this presentation and the data that we are requested to talk to you about today, we have 3 years of infraction level discipline data for the schools requested in the Little Rock area. We have data on the type of infraction, whether the student, for example, was cited for disorderly conduct or fighting or truancy, etc. And then we have the consequence attached to that infraction, whether a student was given a out-of-school suspension, in-school suspension, any of those sorts of things. We have trends over time we can share with you, reports by racial group, broken up by student racial group, and by other subgroups, such as whether the student was eligible for free or reduced price lunch, whether the student was special ed, or whether the student was an LEP student. And finally, we have data broken down by grade. And please, again, feel free to interrupt and ask any questions. We might have more than what I'm presenting to you here. It was made very clear to me that what we were to present to you here were the exact questions you asked and nothing else, but we might have more information, and I'll be happy to let you know if you ask. The schools in the analysis, the ones that we were tasked with gathering data on, include 41 schools from LRSD, all 29 elementary, 7 middle, and 5 high schools, 11 specific schools from the PC SSD school district, the 11 schools totally, which you've got listed, and the 11 schools, I believe, that is roughly 6 elementary, 3 middle, and 2 high schools, something like that. And then finally, there are 11 open enrollment charter schools, again, the ones that we were specifically tasked with gathering for you.
May I, excuse me for interrupting you. Would you prefer that to be interrupted at the point of the question?
Sure, absolutely. I'd rather clarify.
Thank
you
you very
questions.
much. It would be very helpful to me if you would do a little bit of background on your office, what your role is, and just a little bit more about your
Oh,
group.
sure. I appreciate the question because I skipped over it for time purposes, and I didn't want to rush. So our office, I'm a faculty member at the University of Arkansas. I teach graduate students, but in 2003, I got together with our dean at the time and built what we called the Office for Education Policy. And the idea of that was we have the fortunate position of gathering data for a living, and the Arkansas taxpayers essentially fund us for that in as much as they fund the University of Arkansas. So instead of just doing research on things that we think is fun to us and looking at arcane, uninteresting things, we focus on public policy relevant questions. So the Office for Education Policy was built so that policymakers who are interested in evidence on K-12 education issues, and recently we're venturing beyond K-12, looking a little bit at post-secondary and looking a little bit at pre-K, but policymakers who are interested in evidence on these issues can come to us and ask us to do a study, to let them know what the data are. So policymakers from a school district might call and say, what's the evidence on full year schooling as compared to the 10-month calendar? Or what's the evidence on single gender classrooms as compared to the standard coeducational setting? Or what's the evidence on this math curriculum or that math curriculum? You can see the point. Or we're engaging in a new curriculum in our school district. We don't know if it works. Can you help us evaluate it and figure out if it works? El Dorado came to us and said, we've been engaging in this program called the El Dorado Promise since 2007. Help us evaluate the impact it's having. I'm happy to say more, but does that give you background on what we're doing?
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yes.
In the same vein, could you explain the difference between your office and Dr. Arola's office?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Dr. Arola's office, I think it's called the Office of Innovation, but her office specifically gets the data working with the ADE and computes the school scores, the student growth scores. So their office seems to me, even though it's called the Office of Innovation, it could do lots of different things. It seems to me they're very busy really working on the assessment data. And that's what they do. So they have the contract to do all the assessment data for the state. We don't have that sort of contract. So folks at the ADE may call us up, as they have, to spur this kind of question and say, hey, we're supposed to do a study on school discipline across the state. We've got the data, but we don't have the person power to do the analysis or the study. Can your office do that? So we're a research office that engages in projects as we're asked, but we don't have the steady stream of assessment work that Denise's office has. Does that help?
That does, thank you.
Okay. So one of the projects we had actually, and thanks to both of you for the question, one of the projects we had from the state was a couple of years ago, there was an interim study proposal where the ADE was required to do a discipline analysis for the legislature. And they shared all the discipline data with us and said, could you help us do this? So for the past couple of years, they've been sharing the discipline data with us and asking us to conduct analysis, share information on trends, and all of these sorts of things. So all the data that I'm going to share with you here for the schools that you've requested, we have for all of the schools in the state, and we can conduct statewide analyses as well. And if you were to ask us, we could also compare these numbers to the state numbers as well across the entire state.
Dr. Ritter, we don't have all the schools in PCSSD, and you said you were requested to do certain ones. Can you just explain why not all of them?
I am not sure. Dr. Arola suggested that. I think it had to do with, go ahead.
South of the river.
Yep.
I see.
But again, if you look at this and your commission says we'd like a broader look at the rest of Pulaski County, we could do that quite easily. And if you saw the presentation we're making and you said, I don't like the format, do it this way or do it that way, we can ask all of these questions differently. So this, I believe, is our first attempt to give you an overview of the data, but it doesn't mean we can't come back if you find it interesting or have further questions. Okay, thanks. So those were the schools we're looking at. So we've got 41 schools in Little Rock, 11 in Pulaski County special, and 11 open enrollment charters. Here's what the schools look like in terms of demographics. And the key demographics people often look at, what's the level of poverty? And you see that the free and reduced lunch percentage, the proxy most often used for poverty, is roughly the same in each of the groups. And that's helpful perhaps then as you look and if you make mental comparisons among the three groups, it's helpful for me at least to see that they're not serving radically different types of students in terms of poverty. They look roughly the same in terms of poverty, these three sets of schools. In terms of racial background, the district that serves the most black students and the least white students is Little Rock. The charters are next, the open enrollment charters, serving 29% white students, 52% African American students. And then Pulaski has the most even distribution of white and black students at 42% and 41%, as you see in front of you. So now that sort of sets the table for the three different groups, and now I'm going to run through a few different slides showing the discipline data for each of those three different groups. Okay. So first of all, you'll note that each sector, I'll refer to each of the three groups as sectors, the LRSD sector, the Pulaski County Special Sector, or the Open Enrollment Charter sector, have slightly different practices with regard to discipline. You'll see that in the discipline consequences in Little Rock, for example, LRSD, almost all of the consequences are out-of-school suspension. So for some reason, the practice in LRSD is not to do in-school suspension often or at all. ALE is another consequence. 3% of the disciplinary infractions we saw had ALE as a consequence. In Pulaski County Special, the split is larger. They do use, in Pulaski County Special, in-school suspension 40% of the time, out-of-school suspension 30% of the time, and perhaps problematically from a data perspective, 28% of the instances are coded as other. So it's harder to know. Now, this doesn't mean that Pulaski County coded it as other. It means that Pulaski County coded it as something that when the state rolls it up, the state doesn't have a specific category, so it ends up in other. We have noted this to the data folks at ADE, and the data folks at ADE are actually in the process of trying to do a better job of ensuring that the ADE categories fit better with the district level categories, so in the future there are fewer incidences in the other category. Because for folks like you who want to do analysis and make sense of this, it's hard to make sense of other. I don't know if other is a very strict punishment or if other is a very insignificant punishment, so that's not very helpful. Finally, the charters are at about 70% of the punishments are OSS and 30% are ISS, with kind of a couple slivers in the other categories. That's overall, however. Let's look at some more detailed analyses within each group. So that's the percentage of time out of all the infractions, the percentage of all the infractions that each sector gave ISS or ISS or OSS, etc. Now, what's the number of infractions? It's hard to think exactly about how you would like to present the total number of infractions. You don't want to just look at total infractions, because if you compared two schools, for example, one that only had 100 students and another that had 1,300 students, total infractions wouldn't be very meaningful, right? You'd expect the school with lots of students to have more infractions than the other. So what we did to equate as best as possible these sectors is we took the number of infractions and divided it by the number of students served. So these are infractions per 100 students. So you see we move from left to right, and we see that Little Rock, for example, in terms of total infractions from 12-13 over to 14-15, has seen a drop from 35.8 infractions per 100 kids down to 32.3 infractions per 100 kids from 12-13 to 14-15. Pulaski County has greater number of infractions and has actually gone up from 12-13 to 14-15 from a mean of 66.9 per 100 students to a mean of 112.6 per 100 students. Above each of those bars, you'll see we have a min, so the school with the least number of infractions per 100 students, and a max, the school with the greatest number of infractions per 100 students. So those min and maxes are for the schools within that sector. So for example, if you look at Little Rock, that means one of the 41 schools had 245 infractions per 100 students, and one school had only 0.4 infractions per 100 students. Okay. And likely the smallest number of infractions was seen in an elementary school, and the greater number of infractions was seen in high schools and middle schools. Finally, if you look at the open enrollment charters, they've gone up from 12-13 to 14-15 from 5.7 incidents per 100 students up to 18.6 incidents per 100 students.
And Dr. Ritter, this is a slide I had a question about, so I asked it now. Is there some policy that we're aware of in Pulaski County Special School District where maybe it's a zero tolerance or something that would indicate why there are so many more infractions in Pulaski County as opposed to Little Rock when there are a lot more students in Little Rock? Right.
No, that's a great question. That's the question we asked, and we have only begun to dig into the data when asked a couple of weeks ago by Dr. Arola and your group. So right now, the idea is just to lay out the numbers. So I imagine your next set of questions would be exactly what you just asked. We'd want to ask what's going on in Little Rock. Hey, why are there no in-school suspensions? Is this just not a disciplinary practice you use, or do you code it as other? Or so right now, I think the point here is just to generate the kinds of questions you have. I'm sorry that we haven't done qualitative data by interviewing people in schools, so we don't know those answers yet.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So that's for total infractions. Now you might wonder, what about the different types of infractions? So I'll move to in-school suspension, and I'll move a little more quickly in explaining each slide because we walked through that last one in some detail. Same story, moving from 12-13 to 14-15 left to right, and you see no blue bars, right? Because we mentioned earlier that in-school suspension is just not a practice that is reported from Little Rock School District up to the state data. The Pulaski County schools had 34 in-school suspensions per 100 kids in 12-13, up to 44.8 per 100 kids by 14-15. And the open enrollment charters started at 0 in 12-13 and moved up to a rate of 5.6 by the final year of the three presented here. So these are for in-school suspensions. The next category we're looking at is out-of-school suspensions. These are obviously more exclusionary, not only taking students out of the classroom, but out of the school for one day or multiple days at a time. And what we've shown here, by the way, is number of infractions per 100 students. When we've done analyses on this or done deeper digs at this, we've also asked number of days of infraction, because just the number of incidents per 100 kids is important, but I think the number of days per child is important as well, because an out-of-school suspension that is 1 day is obviously less impactful on my learning than if I were suspended for 7 days or 8 days, etc. So that's another type of analysis we could do if we were asked, rather than just the number of incidents. So what you see here is Little Rock's at 35.2 out-of-school suspensions per 100 students, and Pulaski County's at 29.5, and the open enrollment charters are at 4.0 in the earliest year. There's not much of a change by 14-15. Little Rock drops a little bit, Pulaski County jumps up a little bit, and the charters do receive a big jump in 14-15 from 4.0 to 12.8. And the jump in the charters, as you can see perhaps in a small set with only 11 schools, was due to one school that was putting more kids in out-of-school suspension. You might note that in 12-13, the max was only 8.7. The max school was 8.7. Then in 13-14 and 14-15, the max school had much bigger numbers, 66.2 and 77.1. So that max school was what was driving the average And then there's the trends over time for other, and there's not much other in terms of Little Rock or in open enrollment charters. The others are showing up in Pulaski County Special, and it moves up from 3.3 up to 31.8 by 14-15. An important question, and one of the reason researchers across the country are looking at disciplinary data now, is there are disparities in the disciplinary consequences levied upon African American students relative to white students. So we looked at the disparities in terms of total infractions by race, ethnicity, per 100 students again, but we broke it down amongst all racial groups reported in the schools, and then amongst other subgroups, FRL special ed. Let me come back and we'll walk through it. So when we look at the total infractions, we see that for Little Rock, white students was 8.6. I'm not going to read all the numbers, but you see from left to right, white students, black students, Hispanic students, Asian students, and so on. But then within each racial subgroup, you'll see Little Rock on the left in the blue. You'll see PC, SSD in the middle in the orange or red, whatever you're seeing. And then the green is the open enrollment charters. And we do see that, as occurs statewide, African American students are referred for infractions at higher rates than other students. And this happens within each of the sectors presented here.
Question, please.
Mm-hmm.
I assume that the total infractions, the number of infractions, is going to include the kids that have multiple problems.
Yes, that's total infractions. So that's not another thing we could look at as total number of kids who've ever infracted. That's not what this is. This is total infractions. So many of the kids do show up multiple times in the database, and many kids show up 0 times in the database.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I'll leave that up for a second. And then we'll look at it by other breakdowns. And if you look at, and I'll tell you a couple ways you might want to look at it. I'll go back to race, and then I'll move over to this one. You might want to look at it, you might want to ask, within each sector, are students, so within Little Rock, or within the charters, or within Pulaski County, to what extent are students of different groups referred for infraction more often? And then you might just ask, within each racial group, do we see patterns where they are referred for infraction more often in one type of school sector than in another? You can compare it either way. But you see the pattern here for each group. The pattern is the same as we saw in the overall, that Pulaski County has the highest rate of referral, followed by Little Rock, followed by the open enrollment charters. Now, if you look at the same thing by different groups, by whether students are special ed or regular ed, FRL or non-FRL, and LEP or non-LEP, we see that non-FRL students, interestingly, and we see different patterns here. So in Little Rock, if we imagine that FRL students are struggling more in school than non-FRL, perhaps it's not surprising that they're referred for disciplinary infractions more often. In Little Rock, you would see the predicted relationship. The free and reduced lunch students are referred at a higher rate than the not free and reduced lunch students. The same story holds in the charter schools. The Pulaski County story is different, right? In the Pulaski County story, the non-free and reduced lunch students, so the 48% of students who aren't free and reduced lunch students, are referred more often than are the kids who are free and reduced lunch.
And you don't know why?
No, we don't. Again, this is the first shot at the numbers, but hopefully you'll have lots of questions and we can dig in. An interesting story perhaps with LEP students. With LEP students, again, if you might theorize that students who are marginalized and struggle more in school might have more interactions, with more negative disciplinary interactions than other students. You'd be surprised that limited English proficiency students have less infractions than their non-LEP peers in both Little Rock and in Pulaski County. That pattern reverses in the open enrollment charters. But these are, the numbers for LEP students are relatively small. Finally, a question you might ask, and we've asked in a lot of our academic work, these analyses were done almost entirely by Caitlin Anderson, one of our grad students. We've looked at disciplinary disparities by subgroup. So what we've got here is within group, I'll focus on the FRL, non-FRL. Within group, we're asking to what extent are the FRL students more likely than the non-FRL students to be referred for infraction. So you'll see that in Little Rock, FRL students are 3 times more likely to be referred for infraction than non-FRL students. The bar of no difference, the bar we would want to see is 1 all the way across, right? That means each group would be just as likely. So in Pulaski County, you see the 0.8, meaning FRL students are actually less likely. They're only 0.8 as likely to be referred for infractions. And in charters, FRL students are twice as likely. So you don't want to see these disparities. So you see that those disparities are largest, the racial disparities are largest in LRSD and in the open enrollment charters, and they're the least large in Pulaski County. And then you'll notice that in LRSD, the Hispanic students are less likely to be referred for infraction. And in the charters, they're roughly equally likely, just 1.2, barely more likely. And the LEP students, in most cases, are less likely to be referred, except for in the charters. We can come back to any of these.
Could you go back?
Oh, yes.
No, this same slide.
Yep.
And this is not a qualitative question, I don't think, but the numbers for Pulaski County Special School District for the discipline for black kids was a lot higher than the number for the discipline for black kids in Little Rock School District.
So you're wondering why the small arrow,
Right.
why the small bar. So
Right.
this is the difference between black students and white students. So if we go back, where's the race, ethnicity? You'll note, you're right, the number for black students was very high in PCSSD, but so was the number for white students relative to every other sector. So really the ratio, what you're doing is essentially 131.7 divided by 51.9. So black students are 2.5 times as likely to be hit with an infraction in PCSSD, whereas in Little Rock, 44 over 8.6 is a higher ratio.
Right. That makes sense.
Okay. Good question. So that's for disciplinary disparities overall. You might be more worried about out-of-school suspension since that's exclusionary discipline, and that's a really big deal because the kids can't learn when they're not in school, and you see that the patterns are unfortunately roughly the same, that students who are FRL and who are African American are more likely to be referred for infraction than are their non-FRL, non-African American peers. And I can go back to any of these slides, but here are some summary points that I'd like to leave you with, and then we can go back and talk to the extent you wish. This is an introductory look at the data. We do have some real concern with the labeling of the consequence. I mean, we've got no in-school suspension in Little Rock. Presumably Little Rock's doing something that looks like in-school suspension. Maybe we need to figure out how to label that better so we have more comparable data. Also, the no action is of some concern. Probably not the no action, the other is of some concern that exists in Pulaski County. Remember that, or please note that disparities within group are not the same as disparities within schools. And what I mean there is when we see, for example, that FRL students are more likely to be cited for infraction than not FRL students. This does not mean that an administrator in a given school is looking at a student and saying, you're economically disadvantaged, you're going to get X. I know you're a rich kid, I'm going to leave you alone. Most of these disparities actually don't occur within school, they actually occur between schools. So what we mean is schools that serve lots of students who are FRL or lots of students who are African American engage in stricter disciplinary practices than do schools that serve more advantaged student populations. So the differences we see are between schools, not within schools. So you would not see these big black-white bars or FRL or not FRL bars within a given school. Within a given school, black students and white students are roughly punished at the same rate. And FRL students and non-FRL students are roughly cited for infraction at the same rate. But within sector, it looks different. And we think it's because the schools have different disciplinary practices, and specifically, schools serving different demographics of kids engage in different disciplinary practices. This is what we think from looking at the past 3 to 7 years of data. Also, I think it's an important caution to say it's not entirely clear what large numbers mean. So you might look at that and say, well, I want to be sure that my kids go to the school where that 4.0 charter school, where there's no disciplinary incidents at all. There's almost zero, 4.0 for 100 kids. 4.0 might mean that kids are not learning and there's all sorts of disruptions and we're just not citing them for it. At the same time, this 35.2, which might look horrible, that might mean that things are crazy and there's all sorts of disruption, or it might mean that the administration at the school is really, cracking down that year and making sure any poor behavior is quickly met with a disciplinary consequence in the hopes in the future there will be less disruptive behavior. So we surely don't like exclusionary discipline. You don't like the idea of kids out of school because they can't learn. And we surely don't like disparities between groups, whether socioeconomic or racial groups. So we know that those disparities are not things we like to see. But whether large numbers are good or bad, we're a bit cautious of saying that, because it could be the case that it might be it might just be an example of a really tightly run ship, for example, or one school just might engage in all sorts of discipline but might not go through the paperwork and write them up. So we want to be careful, we want to be cautious with making too quick a generalization based on these numbers. Finally, other data that I think would be worth examining, and you could examine, we could examine putting referrals next to infractions, because I don't like these disparities we see any more than anyone else does. But these disparities are in referrals. These are in kids, so we cite students for misbehavior more often. We cite FRL students than not FRL students. It's possible that's because I, as an administrator, have a proclivity to cite FRL students, and that's my weakness as an administrator, or it's possible that the FRL students engage in disruptive behavior and I'm just doing the right thing. Either story could be true, and you can't distinguish between those stories just by looking at these numbers. But what we do have and what we can do is we also have data that allow us to connect the actual infraction to the actual consequence for the infraction. And then if you find out, then we'd hope that whether I'm an FRL student or not, a black student or a white student, if I engaged in disorderly conduct, we should get roughly the same consequence. So those are analyses you can do where we can tie consequences to infractions. And as a sneak preview of what I imagine you might find in Little Rock, I can tell you what we found across the state is, not surprisingly, but unfortunately, we do find that African American students receive stricter punishments for the same referrals across the board, not within school. So again, this means that an administrator isn't giving two different punishments to kids who do the same thing in front of them just because they look different. But it means that schools serving high numbers of African American students are engaging in more strict disciplinary practices than schools that do not serve high numbers of African American students.
Quick question, do you see the similarities in administration? So if you're looking across the state, are there then more schools that have a white administration or a black administration administering stricter disciplinary actions?
So that's a great question, and one that has been asked before. We don't have data yet, we're working with the state on getting this, on the racial breakdown of the school staff, of the administration. We do have something on the school staff, which would certainly be a proxy for what the administration might look like, but not exactly, it wouldn't be a perfect match. But we are trying to figure out how to ask the exact question you raised. We have not been able to do that yet, but that's on our list of analyses to run. And again, the patterns I just described to you were statewide patterns. We haven't run that analysis only for the schools that you have in front of you, but it is something we could do in the future if that were something you were interested in. And I think I might have had one more point on the slide, and then I'll stop. Okay, again, we can look at disparities within school, but better yet, we think the most important thing that I would want to look at and that we're looking at is, we might want to look at the severity of consequence for a given infraction. And we do know that schools across the state differ in severities of consequences. So something else we're going to be asking, are schools that give more severe consequences, how do they look different than schools that don't? Do they have higher academic achievement, lower academic achievement? Do they serve more advantaged or more disadvantaged kids? We've begun to dig into that, but we can still dig into that more. I think that's all I have for you, but I'd be happy to answer more questions if you would like. Thanks for your attention.
Quick question, when you use the term advantage and disadvantage, are you thinking economically or?
When I used it in that sentence, I meant economically, but you could think of it more broadly, right? We could look at higher achievement or lower achievement or advantaged in lots of different ways. Yep.
I have some additional questions outside of the discipline data, so I will defer if anyone else on the board had questions about the data.
Can you describe quickly, how do you communicate the substance as well as the particulars of your data mining to the decision makers, both at the school level, the district level, and at the state level?
And you don't mean with this specific analysis only, you mean generally?
Just in general, but maybe this one specifically.
Well, what we've done with this particular discipline study is we've done reports for the state board. We've also gone out and done reports on this, longer versions of the sort of thing I've done for you, but for the whole state rather than for just this subset of schools. We've done it for the Arkansas School Boards Association. We've shared the data in written documentation with the Arkansas Department of Ed. There's been some moves then as a result, so the Arkansas Department of Ed is trying to work with their data systems to get better data because they want to be cautious in citing schools for being overly severe or not severe enough or whatever until they know the data are clean and good. And they have some of the same concerns that I voiced to you. Lots of things in the other category make them nervous. So with this particular study, we have worked through the state board, we have worked through the ADE, we've given presentations. With lots of other studies on academic analyses of traditional schools versus charter schools, of schools in one region versus another. We produce state report cards. We sometimes produce regional report cards. We produce policy briefs, written reports. We give testimony before the legislature. We try to reach out to policymakers through a few different vehicles.
But generally not specifically with this subject study to, like, for example, the superintendents of Pulaski County Special School District.
Oh, no, this is the first time we've literally completed this analysis a week or two ago.
I see.
So you're the first group for
But
this.
will you?
Sure, if we're invited to, absolutely, we're happy to share. And in fact, the question we would have, as I imagine you would have for Little Rock, is, hey, do you guys do ISS? Do you do in-school suspension, and how do you code it? And what's in the other category? And again, what's in the other category for Pulaski County Special, it might not, when Pulaski County Special codes it, it might not be other. It might be something, though, when it gets to the state, they don't have a category that fits, so that's why it might be other. But we could probably look at that and compare the two. Right now, all we have access to are the state data that were shared with us. We don't have access to what the school districts fed up to the state for the state to build its reports.
It just seems that it would be very significant to have some meaningful conversations with folks that are down there working with these children in the schools.
Agreed. Thank you.
Thank you. So as you know, we're on a tight timeline to complete our task. How long would it take to answer the additional questions that you posed at the end of your presentation, to dig a little bit deeper into the data to provide us with more information to help us in our next steps on the referrals versus infractions and the severity of consequences among different groups?
Well, the severity of consequences, we've already built a model for that. We haven't pulled it for specific schools. I don't know, Caitlin, is that a 2 or 3 week job or much beyond that? Easy for the person who's not doing the work to say that. It feels like a month perhaps, but maybe on the outside. I mean, it depends how different the Little Rock results are from what we had statewide.
Okay.
I'd like to see that information if we could get it if we could take a look at that as we're considering everything we have to consider. I think that would be beneficial.
Would we be able to, I mean, it would be helpful if you asked very specific questions. So when you said I'd like to see that information, maybe we could email back and forth, or I don't know what the protocol is if it has to go through someone, but where you just highlighted the questions you had and then we could email back and say, yes, that's a question we can answer quite easily, or that's one we don't have the data for. It would be most helpful, and it would facilitate the research best if we could, go back and forth and we could talk to you about the kind of questions we could answer. But yes, this is the job of our office. This is what we're supposed to do.
So the answer to that is yes. We can email back and forth together as a whole group and then make the questions transparent.
Sure. Yeah, that's exactly what we were developed to do.
Great. Thank you.
Any other questions right now?
I had a couple, and this kind of goes to our broader picture of what our board is charged to do. And in getting ready for this meeting, I did a lot of reading and researching. And I went to your website and I noticed that in 2009, you did a study about the impact of students leaving the Little Rock School District going into the charter schools, which I thought that's exactly what I've been asking all this time. But that was in 2009, and obviously the landscape, the numbers have changed. Is that something that you have done since or plan to do since 2009, or kind of update me on where you are in that process, if you don't
That's a great question. People in our office have anticipated that this might be a question. So we're in the middle of conducting a more recent analysis, trying to follow the model of the paper that you looked at. And that's something that we may have. I mean, I know you're on a tight time frame, but I also don't want to push it and come up and give you answers that are incorrect, but something that I think we can have some ideas about in the next 3 to 6 weeks.
So you have, I guess you already kind of started that process, is
Yes.
what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
Part of our charge is to, I mean, we answer what policymakers like yourselves ask us to do, but we're also trying to anticipate questions that might be of interest. And if we've got neither of those in our queue, we just ask questions that we think will be interesting.
And instead of me summarizing it, for the sake of the board, they may not know what the 2009 paper was charged to do or the purpose of. So if you can summarize that for us, just so everyone's on the same page.
Sure. So in 2009, and I think it was 2009 and 10, we did two different versions. We did a follow-up, but we asked the question of to what extent are charters more or less integrated or segregated than the traditional public sector? And it's obviously a really heated question. It's also not an obvious question because people have different measures of integration or segregation. What we did to measure integration, we didn't look at poverty, we looked at race, and we called an integrated school a school that looks as close as possible to the racial dynamics of the entire county. So the entire county at the time, I think, and forgive me if I'm incorrect on the exact numbers, was something like 68% minority students in the county, in the public schools in the county as a whole. And so we said the closer a school is to 68% minority, the closer that school is to integrated, as in reflective of the broader community. And you can even see right there how mushy these arguments can be, because we chose the county as being the broader community. You might say, no, I don't think that's right. I think a better reflection of the broader community is the city or a 3-county area or whatever. You can imagine there are lots of assumptions you have to make. But what we tried to do is lay very clear in the paper, here are the assumptions we're making. You can disagree with them if you like, but we made assumptions that our measure of integration, again, was to what extent do you look like the broader community. We defined the broader community, as we said, and then we asked, what did it look like? What kind of schools were kids moving from and moving to? And what we found essentially was that when kids left for charters, white students who left LRSD for charters were leaving above average white schools. Black students who left LRSD for charters were leaving above average black schools. So in other words, kids were mostly leaving schools where they were in the majority. So if you were to categorize moves as segregation increasing or integration increasing, we found that the moves, more than half the moves, would lead to increased integration. Because a student, let's say, if a white student leaves an overly white school, that school becomes slightly less white and becomes more toward the middle. If a black student leaves an overly black school, that school becomes a little bit less black and becomes more like the community average. So essentially, now that's not the end all and be all on it, but essentially we found it wasn't white flight, white students leaving predominantly black schools. It was kids were in schools with kids who mostly looked like them before, and they moved into schools where kids who mostly look like them. And essentially what we found is maybe in other districts where the traditional public sector is pretty well integrated, maybe then the opening of charters could lead to some shifting that might lead to segregation. But the traditional public schools in Little Rock were pretty darn racially segregated to begin with. And the relatively small number of kids, given the whole student population, moving to charters didn't make much of a dent in the overall integration or segregation of Little Rock. That's a long summary, I apologize, but
it was great.
That's my best shot at it. I don't know if today might be different, because that was 2009, so there's been 6 years of moves since then, a slightly larger charter sector, but still not that big relative, but a slightly larger charter sector, so the answer might be a little different. But back then, if you were to say Little Rock schools were racially segregated, I would have found it a stretch to say charters are the reason that Little Rock schools are racially segregated.
But I think when I was reading that paper, that it seemed to be it would be an easy transition to also answer some of the questions that we have talked about in our other meetings, like why are families going to charter schools, or what type of students are leaving Little Rock School District going to charter schools, not just based on integration,
but other characteristics of the kids.
Exactly.
Yes, we could answer a lot of those questions, but not the first one, because you began it with why, and I don't know how to. But we can answer the questions on do student. Yeah, in fact, we are digging in. One of the things we didn't do in prior years, because we didn't have as good a data, we didn't ask. So the child who left, was he an abnormally high achieving child in that school, or an abnormally low achieving child in that school, or just a medium student within the school? So not just overall, not just was the student proficient or advanced, but how did that student fit in with all of the peers? So that I think is that's a great question that we did not answer, but I think that would be interesting to see. because you might have struggling students who are leaving to try and figure out a way to work better. Or you might have high achieving students who are leaving. I know there are theories on both sides, and that's something we're looking into now.
Okay. Thank you. Also, in... Go ahead.
1 minute.
Yep.
I have a note from Dr. Arola.
Yep.
She says she is listening and recording questions for
So that-
follow-up.
Does that mean I shouldn't say anything bad? So watch yourself,
And making
Antoine.
notes for clarification. She didn't mention you by name. She says, please remind the group that we're going to be bringing in a researcher who will pull all of this work together and will collaborate with others, such as Dr. Ritter, to put the data into a full picture.
That's a great segue, Dr. Arola, wherever you are, to my next question. Kind of the history lesson of our group, as I understand it, the March 31st meeting, that was a huge, long meeting about the expansion of charter schools and questions about a plan. Then at the next state board meeting, they voted to create our group as a advisory group to do what we're doing now to make a recommendation. Before that March 30th meeting, that March 31st meeting, on March 30th, on your blog post, you indicated that the state board, and I'm sure this is your opinion, or I don't know if it's on behalf of the Office of Education Policy, but that the state board should approve the expansion of the charter schools, and then we should reach out to the Center for Reinventing Public Education to work on the collaboration efforts. Does that ring a bell to you?
It does ring a bell, although I don't write every blog post there,
Okay.
but the general concept rings a bell. I didn't remember the reaching out to CRPE, but reach out to CRPE to talk about how they work together. Our general belief, I think everyone in the office was of the belief then, that if the professional charter advisory panel, the panel that was to hear the charters and decide, yes, you've made a good enough case, or no, you haven't made a good enough case. Our argument there was simply, we didn't think it made sense for the state board to overturn the decision of that professional group. That was a more general argument that if we've empowered this panel of professionals who know how schools operate to make these decisions, we didn't think it made sense just because it was a political hot button issue for the state board to overturn it. That, I think, was the theme of that. And I'll give you background on why we've come up with this.
No, and I appreciate that, but that wasn't exactly where I was going.
Okay.
I was more concerned about, because as Dr. Errol mentioned, the researcher, which is a Center for Reinventing Public Education, and you made the recommendation, or someone, whoever wrote the blog, I'm attributing to you, and maybe I shouldn't have, is making a recommendation that is the type of entity that this State Board of Education, which they have entrusted us with that, to make that a kind of advisory opinion to them, that we should research, collaborate with the CRPE. And my question to you is, what was your understanding back then about the CRPE as it relates to how they could help collaboration between charter schools and traditional schools in Little Rock?
I think the spirit of what we meant to say was that we should research ways in which other cities, communities have encouraged collaboration between the traditional public sector and the charter sector, not specifically do exactly what CRPE says, but CRPE has done some research on that. I think we meant that more as an example, but that we should reach out and look for strategies to get the two sectors to work together. That was the spirit, I think, in which that was offered. So not specifically CRPE has these great guidelines that you must follow, but specifically, let's figure out strategies that we can borrow. And I would argue, separate from that blog post, that the way I would do it is I'd want to get a set of ideas from other places and then see which seem like they might fit here. But I'd want to get, rather than follow one set of guidelines from one specific institution, get a bunch of ideas where collaboration has seemed to work, review them, and see if any of them seem like they might be helpful here. That was the spirit in which we made that point.
Okay, and I understand that, and I will say this, and if you want to respond, you can respond. I'll say this to the board and on record. that the example that Dr. Ritter just gave us from, the March 30 example of using a CRPE before the state board made the decision to expand, before our group was formed, seemed to be the exact example down the road that we're going. So as a board member of this group, I want to be clear to my other board members that it seems like that this example may have been the perfect example or the predicted example or coincidental example to where it seems that we're going here today. So I don't know if any of our board members want to discuss that, but I want to share that on the record. And if you want to respond, you can, but I'm not necessarily asking you to. But I appreciate you explaining where you were coming from.
Yeah, so we have several authors who would write the blog post, and so I don't believe I wrote that particular one, so I gave you the general spirit of our view there.
And if I was attributing it to you and someone else wants credit, I'll be happy to give them credit.
I'm just more so apologizing for not having the details off the top of my head. I'm making up an excuse. I should know more, but we do publish one a week, and often the other researchers in the office publish them.
Okay. Those are the questions I had, Chairman, for Dr. Ritter.
I know we're tight on time, but I do want to ask, the way that the blog post reads, it seems very clear that the recommendation was coming not from you particularly, but from your office, to go ahead and approve the expansion and then follow it with learning how to get along. It seems to me that's kind of backwards.
Well, my view again it wasn't about this specific expansion. It was from having watched the Charter Hearing Board for the past 10 to 12 years and noticing how the charter hearings seem to run with the advisory panel. I don't know the exact name, I apologize. But the Charter Hearing Panel relative to the state board, the Charter Hearing Panel was initially made of folks who had been administrators in schools and really know what's going on, and the questions that are generally asked when the charter panel either rejects or accepts charters are really strong questions about what curriculum are you running? Do you have a site? What's your administrative team? How do you plan on recruiting students? It seems to me that they do a nice job of vetting the charters, and I've seen them say no to a bunch, and I've seen them say yes to a bunch. So my argument was not, again, specific to this. My argument was the state law says there are these things called charters. The state law says this advisory panel is empowered with accepting them or not accepting, or authorizing them or not authorizing them. It didn't seem to me that this situation was unique enough, and I'm taking credit for writing this because the spirit of this was definitely my view, I didn't think that this situation was unique enough where all of that logical foundation, in my view, for following the ruling of the Charter Advisory Panel should be overlooked. Now, I can see how someone would make an argument and say, no, this is so big, this is such a big deal with the capital city and with the need for charters and TPSs to get along that we need to revisit it, and we perhaps should overturn what the Charter Panel said. It was simply my view that the professionals on the Charter Panel had done their due diligence and had decided these are good, and these other ones we're not going to authorize aren't good. So our suggestion was the Charter Panel is the group that is empowered to authorize, and it made sense to us to allow the authorization to stand. And I guess with regard to the specifics, I was compelled by the schools, the waiting lists and these things. I think these matter, in my own view, that if there are people on waiting lists who want additional education options, I didn't love the idea of telling kids and families they should wait while we make a plan, because we could have made a plan for 10 years, but we're talking about making it now. So that's my own view. Charters have been around, LRSD has been around, PCSSD has been around, so I didn't love that. But again, that's my own and my office's view, and that's not research-based, that's opinion-based, that's my opinion. And I try when I'm up in front of you as best as possible, and please do ask me if I don't, to separate what's data and fact, the discipline numbers are data and fact, versus what's my view based on my experience and my studies of these things.
Thank you.
Comment from Denise? Okay. Dr. Rolla says that Jordan Postamentier, I'm sure I've mispronounced his last name, from CRPE, will be here on the 29th and he will answer all the questions regarding their office's work and background. And she says the reason we are talking to them is because there are very few people in this research space who may be able to do this work. And she hopes that you will bring all of your questions to that session and have a very thorough interview with him.
I will.
We will.
Now I see the origin of your question. I didn't know that until just now. I'd be surprised if our blog post made any difference, but that would be interesting if it did.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't. I assumed that you knew that he's coming next
No,
week, so
no.
that's why I said that.
Now I understand where you're, yeah.
It made sense that that's the example the road we appear to be headed down.
So-
So that was the basis of my comment.
So if it does, that means at least one person has read our blog post, so that's good.
Well, 2, because I read it.
3.
You might want to, you might find it interesting.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, thank you, Doctor.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Ritter. That was insightful.
We're gonna go, Mr. McKenzie.
Next.
Yes, sir.
Go up front and
I got a lot of tough questions for this next presenter.
Okay, I've given you a larger output of the set of maps that we got last time, so hopefully they're more legible, and we have some deep plots of those that we'll leave with Deborah here on the walls, with the school names on them that are even more legible still. So I'm going to give a demographic overview of the central part of Pulaski County. This data is from a presentation that I typically give the Leadership Greater Little Rock. It's kind of a subset of that. So Antoine, you've heard this before, and I suspect you might have some questions. The data was compiled by MetroPlan, we're a council of local governments, and the designated metropolitan planning organization for the Central Arkansas metropolitan area under federal transportation law. We've been collecting this kind of information and doing public infrastructure plans since 1955. Our latest long-range plan, if you want to look at it, is Imagine Central Arkansas. You can look it up at metroplan.org for all of those out there that are interested in your regional comprehensive plan. Now let's see if I can start this thing. Somebody help me? Am I going in the right direction? Am I pushing the right button? No. Okay, here we go. Nope. Different one before that. It does take a village, but here we go. Okay. So let's start. William Shakespeare famously said once, "What's past is prologue." So we're going to go back and look at the past to see how we got to the present, and then we're going to look at the future. This happens to be MetroPlan's crystal ball. It's a staff member doing population projections. Every good long-range planning organization ought to have a crystal ball. Well, this is what our metropolitan area looks like from the satellite view. This is the 4 urbanized counties of the metropolitan area, Pulaski, Lone Oak, Faulkner, and Saline County. You can see the highlighted area are residential developments. You can see the traditional growth axis is along the old Southwest Trail from the northeast to the southwest. And if you do that, that axis crosses the Arkansas River at the Little Rock. And so downtown was traditionally the center of metropolitan growth. And since the 1970s or so, we've seen axis develop to the northwest. That would be northwest Little Rock, Maumelle, and Conway. The urban real estate professionals call this the favored quarter. It's the high-income sector, typically location of high-tech jobs. In that quarter, there is not a balancing axis to the southeast because of the way the river turns down because of the mining geography, because of the wetlands in the area. Not particularly, the soil doesn't perk, it's not particularly suitable for urban development. It is a single jobs market, it's a single housing market, and it's a single educational market, and it's all knit together with a system of interstate highways. Arkansas was the first state in the country to finish its interstate highway system, and we did that in the 1980s probably. For the longest time, back when Conway was a city of 14,000 people, we had excess capacity on the radial freeways. Not the case anymore. So, up until about the 1980s, we were a relatively compact metropolitan area. There was a little bit of white flight out of Pulaski County into the surrounding districts, starting with the implementation of school busing for racial balance in the early 1970s. But there wasn't a huge amount of white flight like we saw in a lot of other central cities after the riots in the cities in the 1960s. In the northern industrial cities, for example, there was massive flight out of the center cities, not so in Little Rock until the mid-1980s. And two things happened in the mid-1980s that we think stimulated significant out-migration out of the county. In 1982, the Little Rock School District sued PCSD and North Little Rock for consolidation, and Judge Henry Woods ruled in 1984 to consolidate all three school districts in the county and to do cross-county busing to achieve racial balance. That order was overturned by the 8th Circuit, but the 8th Circuit ordered Little Rock School District boundaries to be expanded coterminous at the time with the city limits. PCSD lost 8,000 students in 14 schools in that transfer. And beginning in about 1985, crack cocaine came to Little Rock. And before that we had local youth gangs, but with crack cocaine we imported the Bloods and the Crips from Southern California and the Gangster Disciples from the Chicago area, and with that erupted nearly a decade-long turf war for drug territory, and that started the out-migration. There's interesting research done by Case Western Reserve University about flight of the upper and middle classes out of Cleveland in the 1920s. And the result was there were two primary causes. One was a lack of faith in the public school system, and the other was crime, or the fear of crime. And by far the most salient was the fear of crime. And that hold true here. So you'll see the bars in the county. You'll see in Pulaski County in the decade of the 80s, nearly 23,000 net out-migration out of the county. You add up the numbers in the surrounding counties, and that just about matches. And so folks were fleeing to the nearest school district outside of Pulaski County, which was Bryan and Cabot and Conway. Now, the numbers in the 1990s, we continued to hemorrhage population, over 24,000 net out-migration. But then if you start adding up the numbers in the receiving counties, it exceeds that, and the same thing in the first decade of the 21st century. So what that tells you is not only were they receiving the out-migrants from Pulaski County, but new folks that were moving into the metropolitan area were locating in the suburban counties, principally because of the school system. Let's see. Yep. So these dots represent population loss and population gain, and this is the decade of the 1980s. And so you're seeing a significant amount of loss along the 630 corridor in East Little Rock, and then gain in other places. This is the 1990s, same kind of thing. and then the 2010s. Now, I want to talk about the reasons for you're seeing population gain and population loss. Part of that is just the classic urban decay. Part of it is we had a very aggressive urban renewal program. The Central Little Rock Urban Renewal Program was the largest in the United States. In 1950, there were over 12,000 people that lived within a 1-mile radius of the old State House on both sides of the river. At the 2000 census, it was down 90%. Part of that was because of urban renewal. Part of it was because we built Interstate 30 and Interstate 630 and tore apart the urban fabric. And part of it was the result of simply decaying neighborhoods. Some of it is the result of lower household family size, and some of it is the result of the baby boomer generation going through the empty nest phase of their life cycle. So neighborhoods go in a long wave cycle that's about 100 years long. It takes 25 years from the starting of the neighborhood to build out, another 25 years when everybody that moves into the new neighborhood is about the same age. All their kids grow up together, playing in the street, and they all turn into juvenile delinquents at the same time, and they all go to high school, and then they move off, and then they move back, and then they move off again. And so I've got 5 kids, so that's 7 people in the household. They all left, they all came back, they all left again, and now they're just 2 of us. That's a huge population loss, but it's not reflective of a neighborhood going to hell. It's just a neighborhood in that empty nest stage. Now the key is the third 25 years, what happens in between the second 25 and the third 25 years of the neighborhood's life cycle. If we start going into nursing homes or passing away, and if our heirs take the property and make it rental property, and enough of them do that, then that destabilizes the neighborhood. But if young families move in with children so that you get a stable mixed age group in a neighborhood over time, then that's the most stable. And then the last 25 years of the cycle is once either a neighborhood renews with that reinvestment of young families, or it turns into rental property, it's milked for income, it decays, and it takes another 25 years for houses to start falling down, which is a lot of what you're seeing in East Little Rock today. So here's another way to look at that. In 1950, the Little Rock city limits are what you see in green. We had 20 square miles. We had a little over 100,000 people and 367 miles of public roads to maintain. The current Little Rock population is in pink or salmon or whatever color that appears to you on your screen. 122 square miles, 6 times the size, and not even double in population. And with 1,232 miles of road to maintain and an equal number of miles of water lines and sewer lines and other public infrastructure to maintain, and a significantly lower population density. Today, the old Little Rock, the 1950 Little Rock, has lost nearly 60% of its population. Okay, and it is still denser per square mile than the rest of the city built after 1950. But you've got a lot of infrastructure that 100,000 people were paying to maintain. Now only 40,000 people are paying to maintain, and that includes public school infrastructure. I happened to stumble upon a map today from 1963. It was a school district map, and I think I'm right about this. These schools were listed on that map in the green area. Kramer, Pfeiffer, Parham, Lee, Centennial, Bush, Mitchell, Capitol Hill, Garland, Oakhurst, and Jackson, all elementary schools, West Side, East Side, and Southwest Junior High schools. And none of those schools are still open. And then in the meantime, 2 new schools, Rockefeller and MLK, were built in that area. So that and the fact that we're anticipating, given the withdrawal of state money to LRSD, I think it's widely anticipated that more schools are likely to be closed in that area. So, I mean, this kind of bears on the whole issue of facility siting, but something else comes to bear. And there are distinct development patterns over time in the city. So you can look at that 1950 area and you see that rectilinear street pattern, typically with sidewalks, because not everybody had a car who was over 16 years old. And so you either walk to work or you walk to the trolley line to get to work, and so you had to have sidewalks. You had multiple connections. You had much smaller schools. Kids would walk to school quite often. From University to the west, then to about 430, then you have this curvilinear street system, no sidewalks. This is the automobile system. There's still some connectivity here, but it's much harder to walk. It's very much an auto-dependent area. And then west of 430, you see this, what one way I called a veritable riot of cul-de-sacs. Absolutely no connectivity. All trips are forced out onto the major arterials. It is very auto-dependent. There's very poor connectivity. If you apply modern school standards out there, you require significantly more land. Because everybody has to be driven, you want to locate on major arterial roadways with high traffic counts, okay? There's increasing epidemiological evidence that areas 500 to 1,500 feet from major roadways are toxic zones because of the fine particulate matter and ozone air pollution, and we're locating our schools there. It's been linked to increases in childhood asthma and even autism. It's a hostile walking environment that contributes to childhood obesity. And from a broader societal standpoint, it generates congestion, requires more cost in terms of transportation for individual parents to get their kids to school, and from a societal standpoint, generates significant air pollution and congestion. And so if you don't believe that, school just started today. Driving to school last week driving to work last week versus driving to work today, you can tell the difference. So there's some external costs there. Now, I want to talk about race and income trends in Central Arkansas over a period of time. This is a story told in 3 colors, black, white, and green. And green being not only per capita income, but green being who makes money for developing it the way that we have developed in this community. Typically, if you were white, you had green. If you were black, you didn't. That has changed over time, but marginally we have developed a growing black professional class who has the money to live anywhere they want to send their kids to any schools that they want to. We also have a change in colors. So we're adding brown and yellow to the mix. So it's not just black and white anymore. So let's start off in 1960. This is, just to orient you, this is the central part of Pulaski County. You can see the interstate highway system there in gray. And this is before the Civil Rights Act, before the Fair Housing Act, but just after Brown versus the Board of Education. So there was some integration in the Little Rock schools, but token only. We were just getting started with our urban renewal program, or some wags called it the urban removal program. There was a conscious decision by the political and business community in Little Rock to significantly resegregate housing patterns. So if we were going to have to keep neighborhood schools, if we segregated the neighborhoods, then we could have segregated schools without de jure segregation, but it would be de facto segregation. So this is what you saw at the time. There is a theory, and we have observed it, in fact, in this area, about a tipping point by census tract. So this is minority population by census tract. And the reason the census tracts are colored yellow and red is because you're approaching the tipping point, which we've seen at about 25% minority population, and the neighborhood tends to tip and will be 40 to 50% the next census and 60 to 70% the next census. That has been true with every census tract except tract 16, which is just south of 630 up there, and that's the Quapaw Quarter. And it has changed racially over time, but it has not had that drastic tip that we've seen in other census tracts. So, this is 1970. We have started using urban renewal to acquire property to build I-30 and I-630, the old Lake Street Expressway. Starting in the 1970s, a lot of the cut and sew and light industrial jobs that we stole from the north, because we're a non-union state, are starting to move away, and some of the working class housing that is now located south of 630, 2-bedroom, 1-bath bungalow, is those jobs are going away, and so that becomes surplus housing. And we're richer as a society, and so 3-bedroom, 2-bath now is the new standard. So in 1980, this is obviously after the Fair Housing Act. Interestingly, the black population that was in the west of 430 and was nearly 20% of the population has been diluted by new white subdivisions as West Little Rock starts to develop. And you're seeing the transition along 630 and now increasingly a move down into southwest Little Rock after as about the time that the Little Rock School District took over the Southwest Little Rock Schools. So here's the 1990 census. The white guys are holding the high ground along the river, and you're seeing increasing racial segregation, obviously south of 630 and then into Southwest Little Rock. 2000, we've got Section 8 housing. So even Pleasant Valley out there is, in the yellow-red area because of the concentration of apartment complexes along a couple of 3 roads out there. And then in 2010, it's a little bit different base map, but now Little Rock is a majority minority community. We've got, let's see, I have that number, 47% white, 42% black, 7% Hispanic, and 4% other. Typically, that's going to be South Asian, Indian, and Chinese professional classes. And then these maps are the maps that you have in front of you that show the minority concentration and also show the racially concentrated areas of poverty. And this is where, and I've raised this question a couple of times, where I'm not sure that free and reduced lunch is the best surrogate for measuring poverty. There is, I think, a substantial difference if we look into it between a poor kid living in Section 8 housing and a West Little Rock apartment in an area of opportunity, and a poor kid living in a racially concentrated area of poverty. What we see in crime rates and every other significant urban pathology is the more you concentrate poverty in these areas, the whatever measure, whether it's single parent households, child abuse, teen pregnancy, crime rate goes up geometrically. And so I think one of the things that I'd like to see a researcher look at is to try to look at kids and trace them back to their specific area of residence, which we can map, and see if there's a difference between kids that are in these concentrated areas of poverty and other kids that might be low income. And then the median income. The white area on the map is Chenal Valley. And then you can see the RCAPs on the map. Here is another way to look at this. And the white dots are households that are white households, the red dots are minority households, and you can see that area concentration south along 630. Now, one of the things that we did do is look at not just the RCAPs, but those census tracts that are close to being. So you can see the march from east to west and then down into southwest Little Rock of these concentrated, racially concentrated areas of poverty. But some of the census tracts a little bit further west that haven't tipped as far or concentrated poverty as much are also of concern. And so the question for the broader community, but for the schools as well, is are there interventions to these neighborhoods that are on this tipping point where we can stabilize them and they don't have to go all the way to the bottom before they bounce back. One last slide. This is the cross-county commuting, and you can see the percent of the green dots are the percent of county workforce that works in the county. 95% of the workforce in Pulaski County that lives in Pulaski County works in Pulaski County, but only 46% in Saline County stays there. So 27% of the workforce in Faulkner County commutes into Pulaski, and the same from the surrounding counties. So much so that all the excess freeway capacity has been used up, and the Highway Department now is studying widening the metropolitan freeway system to accommodate this increased commuting. There's some folks that say that highways cause white flight. I don't think that's the case, but they certainly enable it. The other interesting statistic here, it comes from County Judge Hyde. For every 10 felons that Pulaski County sends to the state penitentiary system, we get 12 felons back, year after year after year after year. Okay? And we have a grossly underfunded state parole system. So if crime and the concentration of criminals is a main cause of families moving out of the county, then it's not just about what the Department of Education does. It's about what the local government agencies do, but there are also other state actors at play that impact what happens in Pulaski County and the schools in Pulaski County. And then finally, this isn't James Madison, I apologize for that, but it's one of my favorites, from Winnie the Pooh. That doesn't make much sense, said Tigger. I know when it started out it did, but it's just that something happened to it along the way. So that's the end of my presentation. Anybody got any questions?
No question.
No question. Okay, great.
Great job.
Several members of the city board have heard it. I've never given it specifically to the city.
Can you repeat the question for the recording?
I'm sorry, the question was, have I ever given this speech to the city board of directors? And the answer is no, but several city board members have heard it.
Great job, Jim.
Great job.
Thank you so much.
Going to the next item on the agenda by Mr. Emo.
Okay, thank you for the invitation to come here. I've never used one of these before. I'll tell you in advance, which is my PowerPoint. I wish I could get away from here, but, and that's an ugly looking guy, so. I'm going to talk to you tonight about village schools. This is something new, something different, innovative, but yet it really isn't. But I think it's a solution, and I've been at this, trying to get this idea across for too many years. Okay. Villages are pre-K through 12 ideally, but they can be 1 through 8. But they're on one campus, and they're going to be self-managed. They're going to have all of the freedoms and the accountability of charter schools. And they're going to be built along bus lanes, so we can use Rock Regional Metro transportation. I think the future's in your hands. This group, I know you're non-binding, but I think your report can be powerful, and certainly it's going to be out there for the community, and I think it'll make a difference. Back in 2005, Shane Broadway wrote a law that encouraged partnerships between school districts and the governments, and also private sector. And you have a copy of this law in your handout, so I'm going to go, unless you had a question about it. I'm going to ask you to think in terms of connecting dots, one of those puzzles you used to work, and Shane Broadway's law will be the first dot. I'd like to see the school district partner with city, county, state governments, and also the private sectors, like Falcon Jet, for example. The only use of that law that I know of is the Lincoln School District worked with the town of Lincoln, and they built together a recreational gymnasium, a really nice building. Campuses, building these villages, eliminates duplication. Obviously, if you put 8 schools together, you've eliminated 7 administrative teams, 7 custodial teams, 7 cafeteria teams, etc. They eliminate duplication. Village schools are rare. There's one in Texas. There's one in Minnesota that I'm aware of, public villages. So it's a new idea, but it isn't really. I'm going to show you that in a minute. A single campus is much easier to make secure, much, much easier. And here's the really important thing. All of the data that the gentleman from the university shared with you would become different if we kept kids together continuously for 13 years, because it becomes like a home. The kids aren't shuffled back and forth and treated like firewood. And in my opinion, we owe the 20,000 some odd children that are going to just have to go where they're told to go. We owe them a really good school. I said villages are rare, but they're not. Here's the Episcopal Collegiate School. It's a village. It's pre-K through 12. It's on one campus. It's along Cantrell Road, a major thoroughfare. I want you to forget what he said about all the pollution, please, for now. I haven't dealt with that before. I thought, oh no, why'd he say that? Anyhow, this is only 31 acres, so they had to build multi-story buildings. First graders have no trouble walking upstairs. If you go to just about any little town in Arkansas, it's a village. This happened to be the first one when I Googled Charleston schools. Excuse me, the first one that had a map I could copy. But you see, even here in Charleston, they've got high school, elementary school, middle school, and they even have their administration building. There's 1,000 students using that. Okay, this is supposed to play. Can you move the mouse around and see if you can make the... Should be a slide bar on there. It should play a video. Is there a... No, there- Okay, well, the best part of my presentation is gone ahead of helicopters. It took you into a village in Lead City, Texas, which is Houston, Texas. Texas has a city within a city, and the Clear Creek School District has a budget of $315 million and 41,000 students. Little Rock has a budget of $319 million and 25,000 students. That's another lecture I'd like to give. There's an issue there. But anyway, they built this beautiful village. I wish it would play. Sorry. It had, I'm talking about Shane Broadway's law with partnerships. They have a beautiful library that's open after school hours. We could do that with cows. They could come into the village and keep the library open, say, till 9 o'clock on weekends. There was a shot of their cafeteria being used, or cafeteria rather, being used for a banquet at night by the community. All sorts of partnerships can be worked out. And the neat thing, it's a year-round school. Somewhere I heard year-round mentioned, you mentioned it in your report. Year-round villages tend to be year-round. Year-round means 45 days in school, 15 days out, 4 45-day period knitted together as a school year, and you actually get 1/3 more school that way. There's all sorts of things you can do with scheduling. Tony Blair in 2005 got the people together and he said, look, I want to build the best school we can build in Darlington, which is where his folks are, northern England. And they said they decided to build a village. And the neat thing, one of the neat things about it, they call their schools academies. This is all on one campus, and they have one academy just for the special needs kids. But you're going to see, here's a map of the village. The English have a different way of teaching. One thing, the kids all wear ties. I couldn't stand that. But anyhow, they have uniforms, and they tend to divide by subjects rather than ages. So you're going to see a math building. Your algebra class might have a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old in it. And the kids in the special school, for example, the swimming pool has a hydrotherapy pool with it. They teach kids to swim in this village. You'll notice that these are the different buildings. You have a math building, an English building, an outdoor area. The English also, along about what we call junior high age, they start letting the kids decide whether they're going to college or not. If they're not, they're going to teach them to be chefs, to design clothing. This school had one of the first virtual labs in the world. Really a neat school Mr. Blair put together, and I wish he'd talk about it more, but it's a village. Now here's a recommendation for a village here in Little Rock, an area that I think would be a good spot to put together a pre-K through 12, somewhere over around Central High. If you look down the left-hand corner, that's Woodrow. There's a lot of old warehouses there, literally falling apart. And there's a railroad track going through this campus on the western boundary. I'm going to talk about light rail near the end of this, and I'm skipping a whole lot, but I'm going to mention light rail. So notice the railroad track. The best thing is its connection to Children's Hospital, in particular the Dennis Developmental Center. I'm the state chairperson for the Children's Catastrophic Illness at Children's Hospital. We have a committee and we make decisions for families, helping families with kids needing heart transplants, etc. So I talked to Dr. Pat Casey quite a bit. I can't tell you formally that this would happen, but he's most interested. He would love to be part of a village here where he could follow the kids, the premature births, especially autistic kids that they work with. right there, close to the hospital, would be great. And plus, they've also said they would be more than happy to perform some pretty powerful counseling. Here's an area. I must tell you a story about this. This is the ballpark area. Mrs. Canis, I got to know Mrs. Canis. She lived at the top of Canis Hill. She said back in the early 80s that she would basically give 157 acres to the Little Rock School District, which would tie together Wall Park and Canis Park. And she said, if you'd call the village, Canis Village. I said, you got it, man. That's not an issue. She said, also, see that old building? And there was an old building next to her nice house. It was the original homestead. And she said, will this be not, I don't want this torn down. I said, well, no. I went over and looked at it. Made out of logs. And she said how they had pulled it up from the bottoms on logs to keep it from flooding. And then behind it was all this old farm equipment. Anyway, I told John Walker, the lawyer, and he drove out in August in his Mercedes, pulled up, and he walked the property. And literally, this was in the Arkansas Gazette. He walks the property with me and Mrs. Canis, and he said, and I quoted him, the Gazette gave us front page and 2 or 3 other pages. John Walker said, if the Little Rock School District will build this village, I will drop all of my lawsuits. Now think about how many millions of dollars. And anyhow, this was in the 80s, and I made what you're looking at right now. I had on one of those old things where you used to punch the button and, original slideshow. I sat in the boardroom. I was supposed to be able to address the board. Anyway, a lady came out and she said, I'm sorry, sir, but we decided not to hear your presentation. So that was the end of that. This is a neat area for a village. 1,800 acres right south of the University of Arkansas. 1,800 acres of bottomland. And it's actually, I put in your handouts the flood report on it. There's been millions of dollars of flood work done on it. It's up to the 5-year flood level, but to make it like perfect, we could build a lake. And how neat would that be? Right in the center of Little Rock to have a recreational lake. The PowerPoint, the video I was going to show you, the Houston village is on 140 acres, but most of it is salt marsh. And I hope you all go to their website. You'll be able to look at that video on the Clear Creek website. And the kids do ecological experiments out in the salt marsh on the Houston village. And that's exactly what we could do here on this bottomland. And it's got a wonderful bird population, etc. This is one more story, short story. This is Zoo School as a possibility of a village right here along a major traffic thoroughfare. There was a fellow named Eugene Revelle who was hired as a consultant, and he picked this as the place. He called it the school park. Same difference. It was going to be K through 12. The golf course was going to be relocated, but there's a lot of land still in this area. That's why the Clinton Library is there. That undone roads and alleyways are there, and there's a lot of urban renewal that's cleared a lot of property. Anyway, this would be a good site. Mr. Revelle, unfortunately, was killed in a car accident, and that ended that village. When he died, there was no more support. All kinds of land in western Pulaski County, the Pinnacle area, lots of land. Mr. Kurish just bought this for Little Rock. It's the Leisure Arts property. To the east, to your right as you look at that picture, is a bunch of forests. Now, you couldn't use the land in behind it because it's like $300,000 homes, but to the right, on Catillus Lane, there's lots of open property, as well as that building is quite large. It'd make a really neat village. This is the third dot to connect. We're resegregating Little Rock. When I was a young kid, we had Jim Crow. Yeah, you couldn't use, there were designated drinking fountains. You had to sit in the back of the bus. lots of Jim Crow rules, and they were bad, and they were unconstitutional, and they were wiped out. But everybody knew what they were. Today, we don't know why. We don't know how come all these 20,000 kids are going to have to go to so-called bad schools. It's kind of, it's happening, but we don't know why it's happening. It's a new segregation, and it's just, village schools would eliminate that, because we need to get away from the neighborhood idea, and we need to build the best school possible for these kids who, I mean, like with me, I remember 57, and now the parents of the children can recall the Rainy School, which became Pulaski Academy. We've got all the private schools and the charter schools, and our traditional schools, our regular public schools, are suffering. We need to build for them the best possible school. The black male in particular is having a tough time of it. 50% of the black males do not graduate high school. Half of them. In Little Rock, I looked for it in the Little Rock website. It's not there anyway. But what is there is 71% of the African Americans do not graduate. Graduation rate is only 71%. I suspect that that's because the females kind of pick it up. Anyway, in a village, we could have remedial instruction within the village. They wouldn't end up being sent to a special school somewhere, which is kind of an ugly thing. The best I taught 42 years. The best 5 years was as a secondary remedial reading teacher. I taught kids who were high school kids and junior high school kids to read, and I had a teacher aide. That was just a godsend. And then one day, an administrator went to some program, probably at the University of Arkansas, and they said, it's a waste of money. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to kid you. It's a waste of money to teach remedial reading. And she came back and closed the remedial. I mean, literally, this was in November, and by December, I became a science teacher. End of my program. That would never happen in a village. Fourth dog. This is going to be a concrete example of working together, of that partnership using Mr. Broadway's law. If Little Rock spent $17 million on their yellow buses this year, one of their charter school, East End, can't use the yellow buses. So they work with Rock Regional Metro, and they buy every one of their students a bus pass for $19.50. If Little Rock bought every student in the 25,000 bus passes, they would spend $5 million. Now, do the math. You say $12 million. Think about what $12 million could do. I mean, it's ridiculous not to partner with Rock Regional. And see light rail down the right-hand corner? I love light rail. My son had a job in Lowell, Massachusetts, and Portland, Oregon. Both of them had light rail. We'd fly up to Portland, get off the airport. At the airport, my wife and I buy a $13 a ticket. We went all over Portland for a whole week using light rail and the bus system. Light rail costs, the federal government's going to pay 50%. There's still grants that get it for 80%. Why am I all fired up about light rail? Well, what are we going to do with 2 presidential libraries? Are we going to have visitors coming to Little Rock? The ambience of light rail is just wonderful, and we could get it. State government typically pays 25%, and that just leaves Little Rock with 25%. But here's the deal: the density to make light rail, the use of light rail needs to be about 1,200 per day. If we put a village along the light rail line, we would easily have 1,200 students using it. So there's an example where the school would help the city have this wonderful thing, a light rail, running from the airport out west or north and south. They'd also, this is Cleveland. This is something we don't do, but it's really neat. We have designated bus lanes. So the bus can get anywhere, and this is in Cleveland, anywhere within 15 minutes is what they advertise, because there's no traffic, absolutely no traffic. So I mean, it would really be a godsend. Rock Regional would love to have the 5 million, and then we wouldn't have to worry at all about transportation. I rushed as fast as I could. I skipped over several slides. I would hope, this is at the end of the meeting, I appreciate getting to talk to you folks. If you're interested at all in Village, I'll come. If you sing in the choir and want me to talk to the choir, I'll be there. Just let me know. The contact information is in your handouts. All I can do is say thank you for listening. Unless there is a question from anybody.
Thank you.
You want to go home, don't you?
No.
Thank you.
One question. You had one?
Sure.
It's not quite time. Thank you very much, Dr. Emil.
Yes.
Emil. We anticipate that it's likely that we'll be closing some schools someplace, not we, but schools will be closed. Do you see any?
Perfect time to get an idea, to develop a village, because if you pick these 5 schools that close, and then you pick the area where you want the village, you're going to make money selling the land that the schools are on. So you're going to have some money coming in. But, I think even if you had to get a bond issue to build a really top-notch village, it's high time we did something. And now think about this. All the crime, all the teenage awful behavior, it's because these kids have been rejected since 1957. They're still being rejected. I mean, when they sent out the postcards, what did they do? They rejected a large segment of Little Rock, the people that sent out those postcards. It's time we help the people in 72209, 72204, and a village would be a wonderful solution. And believe me, if you keep kids together in one place for 13 years with good teachers and a director, a good director, just like the guy that directs the East End, he'd be a great village director. And it's not right for the charter school, which is what we're doing, but those charter school teachers are $10,000 less. I mean, we're doing our charter schools in the backs of teachers. And they can be told to leave anytime. They have no security. And the same with the little children that go to those schools. If Johnny misbehaves 3 or 4 times, they're out of there. That's not right. So, my brain is just flying. I'm way ahead of my mouth. But a village is a perfect solution to the problem of having to close schools down, but replacing it right there in the central neighborhood by Children's Hospital with a beautiful village where the children can stay together for like 13 years and be, as Baker Curris said, loved on. Because that's what made Baseline different, by the way.
Okay, Mr.
Thank you for the question. At least I got
Thank
one.
you. Thank you. You're really an ambassador for, on fire for your ideas. We appreciate your passion. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Next on the agenda, the requested of charters, ADE Charter Office. You had questions about that?
Yeah, I think on the agenda is the CSP grants, and I had a few questions, and I guess they're directed towards Ms. Boyd since she's approaching.
Good evening.
Good evening.
What can I answer for you?
Yeah, and we don't have to go through the full application, but some kind of specific questions. The 2010 grant, I guess we got the application for 2010 that was awarded to the state, just as a kind of a background. That's correct?
Yeah, it was requested So I provided both of them.
Right. And the money, and as I read the application, it seems like there was money that the state received specific for not only open enrollment charter schools, but also district conversion charter schools.
That's correct.
And my question, and I guess it kind of applies to 2010, 2016, is that whose role is it to determine once that money comes in, which charter school and which region is awarded those funds?
Right. In the past, with the grant that we're under right now, that'll be ending in next May, if you were awarded a charter, then you were awarded grant startup funds, district conversion and open enrollment alike. So in the very beginning, towards the very beginning of this grant, each school was getting about $600,000.
So it's pro rata, everyone got the same amount?
Yeah, and then we were running out of money, so it became a lesser amount in the fifth year.
So, and as I understood the application, the money that you receive is same for each year, right? So for example, at least in the 2016 application, we're requesting $7 million per year each year, and then we kind of divide that $7 million up, correct?
That's correct.
And that's the same framework we're under currently?
Right now we're in a no-cost extension, so we requested more money than we were able to spend in the first 5 years, so we continue to divvy that money up until it's gone.
And specifically as it relates to, and I understand that this grant is for the entire state of Arkansas and not just the area that we're concerned about.
Right.
But I understand that I forget what year it was, but Cloverdale Middle was converted to a charter school. Mm-hmm. And my question is, was some of those funds directed towards Cloverdale?
I can look it up and give you a specific number, but I believe they received $600,000.
And are those funds earmarked? Can they be used for anything, or is that you get?
Right, they have to be used for planning and implementation purposes. So, they can be used to buy new equipment. I think in Cloverdale they use them to buy tablets mainly, and then they also built, I believe, a greenhouse. At the same time, the Cloverdale school is also getting school improvement funds, which was a significant amount. So there was a lot of money going into that school to do different things for the children there.
So the money couldn't have been used for the repair of the facilities?
Planning and implementation funds cannot be used for construction.
But it can be used to buy things, not fix things?
Right, it could be used to buy desks or like the greenhouse, for example.
Lockers?
It could be used to buy lockers, yep. Things you need to start up a school or implement a school program.
And I know you have the information, but I was looking online. Can I find that information, how much money was to each? You said the money was divvied up pro rata. Mm-hmm. Is that available to the public?
Through a FOIA request. It's not published anywhere to my knowledge, but yeah, I can definitely provide it to you.
I'm always asking FOIA questions,
huh? Okay, it may be in a commissioner's memo that I'm not familiar with, because sometimes a lot of times we release commissioner's memos with details about how funds are being distributed. I don't know if that's true for CSP funding.
Okay.
But I can find out.
If you're going to request it, just request it, and we'll put it out here for the public.
Okay. And request it through you?
Just, yes.
Okay.
Or just say right now.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, I would like to have that information.
Okay.
Is that good enough?
That's good enough.
Okay. I think there's been some talk from I've heard from the department that some schools in Little Rock may be converted to district charters in the future. So that same process would apply to those schools as well, if more schools are converted to district charters under the 2016 grant application?
Only if we're awarded that grant from the federal government. It's not going to be the exact same process. It's going to be a more competitive process, and emphasis is going to be placed on schools that are serving high-need populations.
So the schools would apply, and then the department would make a determination which schools deserve which amount of money?
Yeah, and we would seek to have, in the plan, we would seek to have outside, like, third-party raters on the grant applications who kind of have experience doing this kind of rating to decide which schools are going to get the funds.
And is that your office particularly that makes that determination of when they apply for the enrollment? I'm projecting.
Right, so we'll set up the timeline, and then we will have people who we'll ask people, and then we'll have people apply to be raters for those applications.
And on page 81, maybe we can pull up the CSP grant application 2016. And I'm looking at page 81 of 507. I read most of this. I didn't read all of it.
Right.
The 507 pages. I got about 350.
Okay.
Read. On page 81, it talks about the dissemination grant. And I think I understand what that is. So before I ask a question, how about you just explain to me in your own words what that would do?
Right, so the dissemination grant is to provide schools and leaders that have been doing a good job with charters to help them spread best practices to other charters. So in the past, we've had the dissemination grant, and KIP has done a workshop with dissemination funds with significantly fewer funds than we've earmarked for here. I think it's about $50,000. And Lisa Academy has also done dissemination as well.
So it wouldn't be, the way, I guess I was wrong. So you're not going to hire anyone. It's people who are already doing it, and then they get the funds to continue to spread the word about how great charters are.
And so all the funds go straight to that programming. So for instance, Lisa put on a workshop. I can't remember at this point what it was about. It was basically some sort of professional development, kind of best practices for others to come in and attend that conference for free.
And I said 81, I meant 41, so I apologize.
Can I interject a question before you leave this? This is best practices being spread from one charter school to another. Are they?
Not just charter to charter. It's open.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask about. Thank you for clarifying that.
Thank you.
And also on page 34, I think it's the numbers on the PDF.
Yeah, so there's a lot of PDFs combined into this one PDF. So if you give me the number out of 507, that would be the easiest.
Okay, page 51 out of 507. Excuse me, page 50 out of 507. It talks about in the application that we're anticipating, and again, this will go back to one of our initial meetings, and we talked about our plan, and I remember you mentioned that our plan needs to be dynamic.
Yes.
And here it says that we anticipate 4 open enrollments and 2 district, did I get that right? 5. 5 open enrollments and 8 district conversions annually. And I don't know, what are we basing that on, that's the expectation of how many charter schools are coming down each year?
So we just looked at applications from previous years. And then too, also thinking about how we have that soft cap on open enrollments, that we can only, like, right now this year, we could only approve, I think it would be 5 more. So there's kind of a limit to that. And traditionally, around 6 district conversions have gone through the complete application process.
And so when we're talking about the 5 to 8 schools, are we being the state, are we seeking more charters, or is that just based on what we anticipate receiving.
Right, we're not actively seeking charters from the Department of Education. However, when a state is awarded planning and implementation funds from the federal government, then you see applicants come because they are able to get a better start. It's just like we'll have more, if we get the federal grant, we'll have more open enrollment applications, and we'll have a lot of district conversion applications as well.
And I think this may be my last question on the next page, page 51 of 507. And you talked about the application process. If this money is awarded for the district conversion charters, which we are anticipating some of the LRSD schools will be, here it says that there will be preference to the educationally disadvantaged students. So does that tie into schools like Cloverdale would probably have a preference in receiving those funds?
Definitely.
Is there any funding or grants that would also apply to the facilities for district conversion charters? Or is it just for like planning and implementation?
Only for planning and implementation. These grant funds cannot be used for construction.
Well, I understand. I'm saying, are there other grants that the state is aware of or seeking that could be used for facility-related issues?
No, but the district already receives funds for facilities. But the answer that I know of is no, not from the state.
Okay, I understand the district receive fund, but I guess when this become a district conversion charter, it kind of goes into a different category. So I didn't know if there was different money for that different category.
No. Here in the state, we're funded at the district level. So the district will receive that funds, and then the district decides, even though there's a conversion within the district, they will decide how they spend those funds on buildings in their district.
I think we're talking past each other. So when a school is converted to a charter within the district and it receives district conversion charter funds, that money goes to the district to go to any school other than the school that's been converted?
Not planning grant funds.
Okay, that's what I'm talking about.
The state foundation funds.
Okay, now we're on the same page.
Okay.
All right.
But the grant funds do still go through the district to the school, but they have to be used for pre-approved budget items.
I said that was my last question. I was untruthful. In connection with the CRPE, I looked at a lot of those compacts, and a lot of those compacts are based on, I'm gonna preface this and then I ask a question. It seems like a lot of those compacts are based on the fact that charter schools in other states do not receive facility funding, and therefore they compact with districts to use structures, buildings, because they don't have the cost. It's my understanding in Arkansas, the charter schools, they don't receive facility funding either, correct?
They did, some of them did last year and some of them will this year. There's been a separate pot of money set aside for that and they have to qualify for it. But prior to that, no, charter schools didn't receive any facility funding from the state.
Is there anything in the pipe where you would anticipate more facility funding for charter schools, or as we make this dynamic plan, should we anticipate?
It's not, it's grant funding is not even guaranteed that it'll happen next year. So I wouldn't anticipate those funds. And again, only certain schools are qualifying for those grant funds. So I wouldn't count them.
What type of schools qualify?
So you can virtual schools don't qualify, which kind of makes sense.
Right.
Schools that have an F or an academic distress do not qualify. Schools who are on probation do not qualify. So essentially you have to be in good standing. That's a really loose term, but to receive the funding.
And again, that different part of money is decided among those schools that are qualified. You make the decision, or your team makes a decision how much money goes to which school, correct?
Right, so we work with the finance department, and the way I understand it is that depending on how many schools qualify and how many students are in that schools, they divvy it up on a per pupil basis.
Okay. I think that's all I have, Chairman. I know that was a lot, but thank you, Ms. Boyd.
You're welcome.
Did someone have a question over there? Ms. Edwards? No.
I have a question, and I think I'm going along the lines of Antoine's question regarding facilities funding for charter schools. Did you say that they are grant funded?
It's like a grant.
But it's
so
an appropriation from the state,
It's
though,
an
isn't it?
appropriation, that's correct.
And only if the legislators change the law will it,
I think it has to be, I think it's in a place where it gets approved every fiscal session. So
Right,
it
but
may
it
or may
would
not be approved.
but it would depend on the legislator specifically saying that they don't want to approve the
Right,
funding.
so if our economy has a shortfall, then it might get cut.
Mr. McKenzie? Okay. Okay, Ms. Boyd.
All right.
Any other questions? What?
Yeah, one more. I got my list here. On page 53 and 54, there's a chart of the funding available per year. And I know we talked about the dissemination grants, which goes to other charter schools to spread the word. We talked about the district conversion. And then there's extra money for the schools that are educationally disadvantaged. And I keep using Cloverdale as an example because that's the only district conversion that I know of in Little Rock. So potentially there would be more money for a school like Cloverdale.
Exactly.
And that, in the current setup, was there more money for a school like Cloverdale under the current grant funding?
No.
Wasn't?
Just a reminder that Cloverdale didn't renew its, decided not to renew its.
Yeah, that was in your documents, that in 15, they decided not to renew its charter.
Right.
I saw that as well. I told you I read most of it.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Boyd.
Thank you.
Next on our agenda item.
I've attached a draft report. Is there any additional information that you would like included?
No, my only question, I guess, for the board and Ms. Kaufman, will we just submit this to the State Board of Education electronically, or are we supposed to do a presentation?
So this report, when you finalize it, will go into the September 9th State Board agenda. It'll be posted for the public, and then typically the chair would come and present the report or his designee. But you're all invited. The State Board meeting is a public meeting. It is live streamed and recorded.
What's the date?
September 9th, Friday. Typically, not always, but typically, the Friday, the second Friday is the reports day,
And what's the time?
9 a.m.
9 a.m.
And I'll take a point of privilege. From some of the State Board members, I know I've been informed, as we talk about our plan, that there's already a school improvement plan for the Little Rock School District that's in place. I tried to access that too online, and I couldn't find it. So I'm making another request for the school improvement plan that's in place for Little Rock School District, because some of the State Board members think that's important to us.
The one other bit of information that we referred to at the last meeting, and we needed to do some work on that I think the State Board might be interested in, was the availability of the consultants that we're looking at and the procurement procedure that the state needs to go through. Do we have any, Dr. Arola, wherever you are, or do we have any update of that information, or will we by the time September 9th rolls around?
You will have it August 29th, when we meet again at
Right.
5 p.m. Open public meeting, live streamed and recorded. You'll have that.
I talk a lot, but I'm okay with that. The August 29th meeting, that we would have that information that Mr. McKinney just asked about, that information is going to come from the CRPE?
Dr. Rowland will be back.
Okay.
And she has been in touch with, where she's been actively seeking researchers that are able to take on this task. And so at this time, she'd like for you to hear from CRPE and let you interview them, and then I'm assuming she'll go from there. That's all she's told me at this time.
Okay. Again, for the board purposes, I'm okay with hearing from CRPE because I think all information is good for us to take all in, but to the extent that we're being guided down whatever road that was already predestined, I want the board to note that I'm starting to feel that way. So I'm just sharing it with the board, not you. You don't have to
Do you have
respond.
someone to recommend?
I'm just sharing my opinions on where I think we are and where we may be going. And there was Dr. Ellis sent us a list of different options of articles. And I'm not turning down or saying CRPE isn't the entity that does this and does it well. I'm just saying to the extent that we're acting in good faith and we're here putting in the time and effort to make whatever advisory recommendation to the state board, things are seeming to be unfolding in a manner where it was already determined. And that's not necessarily I'm not pointing the finger at you, I'm just stating on public record, live meeting that's recorded, open to the public, my opinions on where we are today.
So we'll get more information on the 29th.
Yes, we'll have more information.
Great.
Okay. And is it fair to say if they have any other information they want to put into your report or the report for the board, that they need to send it to you?
Yes, by the end of this week, because I'll have to load it up into the agenda.
Okay.
But it would be preferable if we did it right now so that everybody could see it and agree on it.
Okay. Does anyone have?
I feel like that was addressed to me, but I don't know what I'm supposed to say.
No.
It's your report.
Yeah.
It needs to be finalized in a public setting.
Well, I would say I had no problems with the report, and if it's appropriate to move to adopt it, I will make a motion.
Okay.
I'll second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Nays? None. Did I speak too soon on nays? Okay. All right. Minutes, report is approved. Next on the agenda, future dates. We could look at some future dates for past August 29th.
I think at the last meeting, depending on what we hear at our 29th meeting, I think that's going to determine
How we move forward.
how we move forward. So I don't know if we even need to
Let's do
consider
that.
dates right now.
I think that's reasonable.
Let's do that. Okay.
Let's do that.
That's fine. The only thing I would say is that because we're working on the Every Student Succeeds Act for the state, we're beginning a 10-area listening tour. So many of us will be gone out on that tour, September and October. So we have limited dates.
And it might be good to provide us a calendar with those times blocked out, so we don't.
So we can put that, factor that in.
Yeah.
For sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions, concerns? Get a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Did we have anybody that wanted to make a public comment?
Do we have
I don't know that
anybody?
anybody signed up, but I just wanted to make sure.
No public comments.
I'll move we adjourn then.
I'll second.
Meeting is adjourned. I'm sorry, all in favor?
Aye.
Meeting is adjourned.
Tell you, Tommy, it's work with the guy.